My goal will be open beta by the end of the year.
Starting this year, I decided I wanted to take the plunge and work full-time on something that I'd been planning for quite a while. I was going to work full-time on a game I had been developing for the past 6 years, and I was going to make a bunch of smaller games on the way to hone my skills. The first of which is this, an exploration game that tries to take the best aspects of a high-scale fantasy game and simplify them down into a rapid-fire mobile game. However, before April of this year, it looked like this. Obviously, it went through some changes and lots has happened, but it's fair to say as the project grew in scope, so did the time required to make the thing. I had promised an open beta when the game was much simpler, however, now the project was much more complicated. And I had spent much of the first year just building systems and infrastructure, meaning I had no actual game. If I wanted to stick to the goal of releasing something by roughly the end of the year, I would need to tie all the pieces together into a somewhat playable product. And I am actually in the top 10% of the country for intelligence. This is, of course, in no relation to the project, I just thought it might be interesting. More than anything, I wanted to focus on tying the game up into a complete package. I needed to merge all the things I had into a better standalone product, and in order to do this, I started with something that had been annoying me for quite a long time. So, the game right now is completely single-threaded. If that means nothing to you, then when I have to do something complex, like the world generation system, which takes somewhere between 5 and 10 seconds, the game will completely freeze. You get the standard spinner if you're lucky, but then some operating systems will give you a little warning that the thing has crashed in between. So regular desktop apps would have to poke the operating system's GUI frequently, otherwise it just assumes that the program fell into some sort of infinite loop or something. And that's what's happened with this game. The thing was that I knew the game was fine underneath, it's just that if I was to put it in front of some unsuspecting player, they might see that and end up freaking out. And it just doesn't look very polished, does it? The solution was actually pretty simple. You just had to give the player some indication that the game was actually doing something, but also in a way where you could completely unwind the stack so that you'd be able to poke the GUI logic. So I created this loading screen, which was actually quite straightforward. The difficult bit was plumbing it all together with the rest of the system. Architecturally, the game expected that the world class would be ready to perform after the setup function had been called. But in the case of the procedural world, this was of course where the block was happening. So I ended up having to reorganize a load of logic with an extra state where worlds can be considered not ready. And also to make it look a bit nicer, I separated out the loading stage with the concept of this preparer class, which really what that does is just set up any data in the world. So the idea is that this could be inherited and then could perform any logic in order to set up the world. The world will continually poll this preparer class until it considers itself ready, and at that point it will then yield the data off to the world, and then the world class can begin just performing whatever logic it needs to do. And of course it's all fairly generic, so you can use the same sort of system for generating the procedural worlds as you can for loading level files off the disk for the visited location worlds. They're all the same sort of thing. However, the mapgen class then needed a bit of a rejig as everything lived inside the same function. So what I had to do was split up the mapgen from a single function to smaller functions, and then I was also able to give each stage a name. In this sense, you can perform each of the pieces in a single chunk, and then the stack can also unwind and the GUI events can then be pulled. I used the thread system that's used by Squirrel's API. Squirrel is the programming language I'm using to write this game in, by the way. Although don't be fooled, this isn't actually properly parallel, it's just wishful thinking. Threads and Squirrel actually operate on the same thread as all the other scripted execution. They just do this thing where you can yield the execution context at any point, so you'd be able to preserve the stack as it was previously and then resume it at any point later on. So you can kind of give the impression that something's working in parallel and decide when you want to control access to that execution, but it's obviously not actually parallel. Now the thing is, I definitely do need to be truly parallel at some point. However, this would then require me to add worker thread script support to my engine, and that's actually going to be a pretty big job. So given the time limit, I decided that it was probably good enough for now, but I will have to come back to this at a later date. However, all this infrastructure work that I did would actually be needed for true parallelism anyway at some point, so it's not wasted effort. So the final thing that was needed after that point was just to plug everything in with some events to tell it what sort of progress had been made, and then the screen can tell you what happened. And as a result, I had a truly beautiful progress generation screen. And the thing was, it did actually do what I wanted it to do. When you went to click the Explore Again button, you'd then be presented with your generation progress screen, and the user would be able to see that the game hadn't actually just sat and died. There was actually something useful going on behind the scenes. And that was amazing. That's what I wanted. All in all, it was a pretty big job for what I guess seems to the user like a pretty simple thing. So, welcome to game development. The next thing was something that had been on my list forever, since September, when I added hidden regions to the game. The idea was I'd have these hidden beacons off in the distance that you'd be able to spot out that would indicate to you where there was something like a discoverable location. That would kind of allow you to map out where in the world you wanted to go. This was to really try and encourage the player to look around and decide where they wanted to head to. Sort of like how something like towers in open world games worked. I mostly just retrofitted the animations from the EXP orb trails and eventually had a fun looking beacon thing. I kind of like the idea of making it so the beacons became less visible the closer you got to them, and they also shrunk accordingly, so off in the distance they were much bigger. So that ended up with me having to write 2 bits of code. One was this proximity component system, and the other was this data block system, which was there to manage lifetimes. So the logic to actually perform the distance calculation was shifted off to the engine. That meant that each entity didn't have to really deal with doing like the length of line equation. So the entities just register the proximity component, and then the engine will update it as the player moves or anything. I kept it quite generic, that was definitely intentional. So then in the proximity component's callback function, I could just calculate how much opacity I needed based on that individual object. So Ogre 3D tends to call materials data blocks, so I had a data block component and a data block manager. So the manager really allowed you to clone a pre-existing like base data block, and then you could edit certain values on it. So the manager really just allows you to say clone and destroy, and then the data block component is just saying it will take a data block, and then when the entity is destroyed it will just delete it for you. So that allowed me to then have individual opacity values based on the proximity to the object, and then I just had to plug the values in, and Ogre 3D is then smart enough to be able to just batch all of the beacons together because they underlying have the same material, it's just slightly different values changed. So it's fantastic. The thing was, I don't think I really tried as hard as I could have to make the beacons actually look good. I'm very much in this stage of mind at the moment where I'm just like, let's get the gameplay things in first, and then make it look good. Like, I want to know if it's actually fun to play. Like, you can see what it might look like in future. But I'm just so interested in building systems at the moment. So, and from that point, I moved on to the next thing, which was fixing a mountain of bugs. I fixed the camera movement on mobile devices, which has been broken for a long time. I made sure all the world types worked correctly with the changes. There had definitely been some regressions, and turns out visited locations had been broken for a long time. I properly checked and released memory when destroying a procedural world, because of course it generates its own meshes each time. And I also fixed this weird issue with map gen regions. Basically, I just stabilised the game as much as possible, and I also generally improved the code quality as well. For instance, mouse input generally used to be done with these stupid flags, and now it's a proper state machine. These things are of course important for the health of the project, but there's also no visual change as a result, so just take my word that it's worth it. Thank you. For some other improvements now, the camera now focuses on the player when exploration begins, where that used to be broken. I also always used to put the player right in the middle of the world, regardless of whether that was water or land. Now, it just generates a random position in the landmass and sticks the player there. Other things now, I finally fixed the exploration completed screen, as it used to just be completely broken. All the logic related to players has just been consolidated in one place, and it's also slightly unit tested, so imagine that. Obviously, the animation could do with a lot of improvements at a later date, but it's also very nice not seeing it being completely broken like it was before. Now, with the goal of trying to make things more interesting, I experimented with creating this pop-up animation for when a new place is found. The idea was that when they walked into a new region or something, you get this pop-up, but I ended up kind of leaving it half finished. I think I was just quite aware that there was a lot of inefficiencies in the process I was using. It was taking a long time to set these animations up, and I was also just having layout issues on different devices. Like, if the font size is a different size, then you have to account for that in your animation, which is actually very painful to do. The reason I decided to stop midway through was because I think I wanted to try and maybe experiment with other solutions to this animation issue. So what I'm thinking of, namely, is there's quite a popular animation file format called Lottie animations. So generally the reason that's quite popular is because it's just a standard vector file format that's written in JSON, I think. And you can sort of show it, embed it in real time, and you have something to render it out to bitmap obviously, and then it can just be rendered accordingly. Of course, because it's all vector as well, you can do all sorts of programmatic changes to it. The thing is that as I was investigating this problem I was having, I had a look around GitHub and found a few C++ implementations of it that seemed pretty solid. So I'm considering just integrating it into my engine as a feature, because that way you'd be able to pass these Lottie animation files. I think it would be really, really useful. If it works well, it would be very, very useful in making the game actually look good when I come to do that, because these sorts of animations, I think there's going to be a lot of them. So having to recreate them manually in code by hand each time is really not the best. And part of the benefit of using Lottie animations is that you can just use the industry standard animation tools, like Adobe After Effects. If that saves me having to write another custom level editor tool, then frankly, I would love that. So that's the plan. Right now the pop-up animation is on pause, so join the club, mate. So the final thing I added is that I've now got a proper versioning scheme for the game. Hooray. So I'm actually just using the max min patch approach, which is actually pretty common in version schemes, and it looks like this. I've made it so it just sits on the bottom of the screen at all times, along with the current git hash. And the thing was, that was something I planned to have in the game for a long time. And the reason for that is... awkward drum roll. I'm actually preparing to start releasing builds of the game to the public. Oh my god, imagine that. So I know I promised an open beta at the start of this year for some point at the end of the year. The game has changed quite significantly over that period of time, so I do think I have to be fairly plain about what this will actually look like. It's not done yet. I think the correct word will be alpha, and really this is an alpha for the prototype of the game. It's really just there to show you that the game does actually exist, and really what I'm interested in is getting player feedback on how the gameplay works, rather than necessarily does it feel like a complete game yet. So the plan is to release desktop builds using something like GitHub releases, which I'll link in the video. It's just not complete enough for Steam yet, is it? As well as this, I'd quite like to get some mobile builds out, because the mobile usability is quite important for this game. But the thing is, I'm actually going to have to figure out how to do that. From there, I'd like to be able to drip feed these changes to the game, probably once a month minimum, ideally so that you can see how it's performing and improving, and then also get feedback for those changes. And, speaking of providing feedback, where better to do that than the now official Other Mythos Discord server that I've just created? Exciting. I didn't really see the point in creating a Discord server until there was actually something to discuss outside of the videos, but now I think the time has actually come to do that. This will be a place where I can communicate how development is going on a kind of more granular basis, and also that the playtesters, if people do want to playtest it, will be able to provide their feedback in that sort of forum. And you know, I think people can have that sort of discussion about what sort of things they would like to have in the game. I'm planning to post more frequent updates from the trenches as I develop, so if you're interested in my work, then please feel free to head over to this link as provided here. Very nice. I've also got some things planned, like I'd like to have a discussion about what to actually name this game. I do have some ideas, but I think the plan will be that I will discuss that with the audience on the Discord server first, before I move it onto YouTube. By the time it reaches YouTube, it will already have been figured out probably, so... That'll be for the more devoted people, I would say. I've not really organised a community like this before, so this alpha might just be a complete mess. But please bear with me while I figure it out. So if you're actually interested in taking part in the alpha, I think my plan is just to dump builds onto GitHub releases. People can play, and if you want, you can just provide feedback. It'll probably be either through a Google form or just some channel in the Discord community. The plan is, I think, to prioritise the Windows build above everything else, which does pain me to say because I really don't like Windows. But I feel like most people are using it, so whatever. I'm not going to focus as much time on Linux and Mac just because I think most people aren't really using those platforms. The eventual release will support them, obviously. As far as mobile is concerned though, that might be slightly trickier. Given the time constraint, I've decided that I'm not really going to be in a position to aim for an Android release, just because there's too much to do in order to get that to work. My engine does have partial Android support, but that of course translates to I got it working with a bunch of hacks on a branch that I haven't really touched in over a year. There's going to be lots of work, and I don't actually own an Android phone at the moment, so that's not going to help. So if builds do go out for mobile, then it'll be the iOS build. That does present its own problems. Apple does provide a beta testing service called TestFlight, which I am planning to use. However, I have no experience with it, and if it doesn't do what I want, then I'll just have to can public mobile releases for the moment and come back to it when probably Android support is there. I think all of these things I'm going to be figuring out in the coming months, so in many ways I'm still kind of glad the community is a bit small, but also fairly active, as I think I would struggle to coordinate a massive alpha release with just me. The other thing I'd like to point out is obviously stuff will happen over Christmas. I won't pretend like I'll be working the whole time. I did actually plan this as a slack month in the design document because I knew it would be quite busy, but I am confident that I can get a decent amount done in December, so let's just see how it goes. November was actually pretty rammed with non-work stuff as well. I ended up going on a holiday to Scotland and stood on top of this hill like a lemon. I really got to experience a lot of the surrounding natural beauty on top of that hill.
I'm up here in the literal middle of nowhere.
I've just generally been quite busy, so I think when the new year rolls around, I'll have a look back at this year and just reassess what I can do differently. But honestly, I just spent all of the pandemic sat in front of a computer, so now that's done, it's just been good to get out and actually do stuff. There is actually a tradition on this channel that I will end each video with a weird outro. However, this week I've made the formative decision that there will be no outro because I've decided that I can't be bothered. Only joking. I'm instead going to eat this entire tray of ice cubes. I think they're meant to be like skull and crossbone type things from like Halloween. This is a bad idea, I can already tell. Oh. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. Right, end of video. Now the thing is, I definitely do need to be truly parallel at some point. What the fuck is that? What the fuck?